Manifesting the American dream. How did post war Americans imagine the good life? In other words, what were the various expectations that Americans had for their society, and how did various entrepreneurs and corporations and the government come together to realize these expectations? Just as a little historical sidelight, this is in a way the an icon of post-war America. This is the prototypical Levitt house, the prototypical post-war family, a GI with his wife and two children. The white picket fence, the tire in the backyard. This house looks almost exactly the same as my grandparents' house in Grand Rapids, Michigan, that my grandpa, built himself with the help of a friend who was a builder for $600 on former potato fields. So this suburban, dream was a very powerful one. Millions and millions of Americans saw this as the good life, moved to the suburbs, and established these kind of nuclear family structures that hooked to a popular culture and a consumer society. Now, one of the things that needed to be resolved in post-war America was that there needed to be a massive construction of affordable housing. Now, this was, in a way, a more general global condition because the war had been a very destructive event. And generally, the destruction of housing stock had been, essentially non-existent in the Americas. Nonetheless, because of the Great Depression and then the wartime economy, there had been almost no housing construction. And there had been also a lot of neglect in terms of housing maintenance. As well, the population expanded. So these conditions, along with the fact that many GIs came home and immediately married their sweetheart and wanted to settle down, created a gargantuan demand for affordable housing. So how was this going to be met? Well, Americans didn't just want to have affordable housing, they wanted a certain type of house. So one of the things that was important to Americans is that you were master of your own domain. In other words, that you weren't renting a house, but that you were a home owner. Generally, they wanted to have a detached house. Since they couldn't afford a lot, this was a relatively small space, often called a bungalow, a single-story house, usually 600 square feet, which is about the size of a one-bedroom condo in Montreal. It's a pretty typical size, but that was, essentially a family home. Although sometimes they could put a little bit more space in the attic if there was a second story. This was also, this detached housing, of course, required a lot of land. So America had a lot of space, and the cities, expanded horizontally out from the city core. But another thing that was going to be necessary for this to work, for this whole system to work, since most of the jobs were in the city, the factories, working in the police department, it also required, of course, roads and cars, and the state provided various subsidies to help those industries that enabled people to settle in these automobile suburbs. The thing which is very important is, what were the ideas that shaped, the American experience of family life or domestic life, or what I call being at home. There's a big difference between a house and a home. A house is, as Le Corbusier says, a machine for living. Home is essentially, this area where you have, a big, deep spiritual connection, because this is the place where you grew up and where you had your first kiss and all these memories of Thanksgiving dinners. So what Americans expected from their house is that it would become a home, that their home was a retreat from all the chaos of the congested city. Often when they came back from the war, they had to move in with their mother-in-law, and a clapboard house in the bedroom. From their perspective, the city had really changed. It was overcrowded. There was a lot of crime. There were, African Americans who had often migrated from the South to take jobs in the war industry. So this was created the feeling that the neighborhood had been run down for people that were prejudiced in a racial sense, or just the fact of the overcrowding, the domestic violence of neighbors, the noise that would spill over. So all of these ideas stimulated a desire for a detached home in the suburbs that was quiet, that was in nature, an area of tranquility, isolated from the demands of the state. You were your own boss. You didn't have your mother-in-law bossing you around. If you think about people that were traumatized by the Great Depression, shortages, hunger, being sent to war, ordered, to storm Omaha Beach, what they needed to have is in their environment to feel secure was, a home where they couldn't be forced to do that anymore, where they could kind of nurse their wounds, not just their external wounds, but also their internal wounds, their dark memories from the war. So when it came to, moving to the crabgrass frontier and converting farms into new residential developments, it also intersected with an American idea of the wilderness, that the American character was made in the wilderness, and that the wilderness was transformed into a civilization that brought prosperity. But you also kept some wilderness where you could go and commune with nature and be spiritually revived. These were, deeper ideas in American and Western culture. There was a difference between city life and farm life. In the 1930s, half of Americans were probably still living on farm, half were living in city. So many of the GIs that were moving to the suburbs, they still had a memory of the farm, and they maybe had grown up there, and they found the inner city in which they came back to after the war an alienating place. And they were looking to essentially the countryside, the suburbs, as a type of middle world. It had a lot of the amenities of urban life, but it also was a natural area where you could relax. You didn't have all that noise, and no one was telling you what to do. You didn't hear your neighbors because there was a separation. And you belonged as part of a community where everyone basically shared your same values. You didn't feel afraid that you might be mugged or encounter someone who seemed to you completely alien. So in a way, the suburb was an escape from traumas and pressures, real and imagined. Now, the post-war American society was also predicated on certain social ideals, and some of these ideals were being projected into people's minds through a new technological invention, which was called the television. In fact, one of the novel elements of the Levitt home was that the home came with a 13-inch black and white television. And on this television, this boob tube, there were what was called situational comedies, like Leave It to Beaver or The Ozzie and Harriet Family. So what were these sitcoms projecting? Well, to Germans or Jews or Dutch people that were leaving the ethnic neighborhoods and settling in the suburbs, which are essentially very rapidly created artificial communities, what the Ozzie and Harriet Family model was projecting was a new mode for post-war American life. It was first of all essentially a nuclear family. You left behind the grandparents. they would have to go to retirement homes. It was also a family in which was very patriarchal. There was men's work and women's work. The children in these sitcoms were always depicted as happy, never stressed or in danger. The worst thing that could happen is that Beaver would put a baseball through the neighbor lady's window. There were no drugs or crime. No sense that in the post-war society, essentially parenting was equated with physical discipline, which we would today call child abuse, but which was called, good parenting at that time, or spousal abuse as well. You were expected, if you were the man of the house, to keep your wife in line. There was no concept of spousal rape. It simply didn't exist. What we also see is that on television, these families are all happy. Everyone's happy with their gender role and their place in society. They're enjoying the suburban life and the prosperity, all the goods that are available. But it's in a way a mythology, right? What was really happening behind closed doors is that, many of these families, there was a significant amount of conflict between the spouses because a lot of the couples that were formed were very rapidly formed, or a man went off to war and came back to marry his girlfriend, but he'd been changed as he went into the war. They'd simply been very young when they'd been engaged, but they still went through with it. Or you brought back a war bride who might be Italian, but had a completely different culture and missed her relatives. So a lot of the couples that were formed and the marriages and the children that came right away were pretty artificial, and some of them, a significant amount of them, were unhappy. At the same time, where divorce was not really an option. If you divorced, you could do it, but you would be shamed, you would be shunned. This wasn't a gender equality workforce. You'd have to, support your children on a secretary's wage or a teacher's wage if you could get it, if you had the skills. So in other words, the projection on the television screen of the ideal Ozzie and Harriet family was pretty far from reality. It was projecting an ideal which various ethnic people could aspire to, providing them a model cues for how they were to live, but it didn't necessarily match up to reality. Another very important component of post-war American society was the culture of consumption. If you think about the slogan of the DuPont company, better living through chemistry, that the inventiveness of American firms, scientific advances would enable the creation of new machines, salad shooters, Tupperware, that would make life easier and better. In other words, the good life was, associated not with, Aristotle's spiritual principles, but was associated with the access to new consumer goods that were being invented by, scientists and these corporations. These new gadgets would provide convenience. It would make life easier for women who could do, 2 meals and then have, leftovers in the Tupperware. In a way, Tupperware really symbolizes how the Americans viewed progress. That there would be new materials invented like plastic that had superior properties to what we inherited before. And that as a result, American living standards would continually improve, and more people would join the ranks of the middle class, and you'd get more and more goods. Now, this idea that material goods could buy you happiness was, of course, not really true, because, as you know from your own experience, Although it's pretty exciting to buy a new iPhone after a few days, it's just another smartphone. So in a way, material goods can't spiritually fulfill you, or it can't compensate for in-depth relationships, deeper spiritual bonds with your friends and family and neighbors. But the way that the post-war economy had been built was really heavily relying on marketing to sell goods so that it would stimulate demand and keep the economy going, providing jobs for workers and create this virtuous consumer cycle. So when it came to the consumer society, there were kind of three elements. One was Madison Avenue, where they were not just selling you products based on their characteristics. This is a very high quality knife; it won't go dull. No, what they were essentially doing was selling a lifestyle. They wanted you to dream about acquiring all of those things, and then they would imagine that you would be healthier. Now, we still have this today. If you think about, beer ads, for example, it's rarely sold. If you're watching a beer ad during a football game, it's not based on this beer tastes great. It's like I'm drinking a Budweiser, and look, there's all these scantily clad women here, and I'm here with my bros, and we're having this great time. So in other words, drink beer, you'll be happy. Now, we can look at it at the surface, say that, well, that's pretty ridiculous, but that's exactly how Hollywood has, or Madison Avenue has evolved. By stimulating these desires, using various manipulative techniques, hiring psychologists, depth psychologists, to stimulate demand, and this was seen as essentially patriotism, rebuilding the national economy. Now, there were more and more ways to sell, and there was also more and more credit that was provided so that Americans could buy these consumer goods on layaway. Credit cards came in, really later in the 1980s. But before that, there were various forms of credit that were available that would enable consumers to buy more, or to every year buy the next model of car. So you were, essentially keeping up with the Joneses and not falling behind. You could bring your 57 Chevy to the driveway, show it off to your neighbors. And essentially what this meant is that belonging to the society, happiness was equated with these various gadgets, gadgets that you didn't need for immediate survival, or which had features like the modern automobile that you didn't necessarily need to get from transportation from A to B, but which were value-added features that enabled you to feel secure. Now, television was a very important medium for stimulating the dream economy, the idea of a better life by purchasing these goods. Many of these consumer corporations were advertisers or sponsors of the sitcoms. They would take away and they would sell these goods during commercial intermissions. Now, when we take a harder look at American post-war society, what we see is that the Ozzie and Harriet family was, in a way, an unreachable ideal. Many post-war American families had mismatched partners that often fought together. They couldn't escape the marriage. So this surfaced in arguments, sometimes violence that could spill over to the children as well. Spanking was parenting. I mean, that was literally true. I mean, what parents got away with, choose the buckle or the belt, which end, that would be considered child abuse today. You could get away with it. Women were expected to put out if the man desired it and went to the bedroom. That was the expectation. If they didn't, you would be perfectly within your rights to beat them. Alcoholism was a very deep problem of the society, in particular because so many returning GIs were suffering from shell shock. We know from certain studies that incest was pretty pronounced in these families, so it was Behind the ideal Ozzie and Harriet home, the Levittown home, there was a lot of darkness. One of the things we haven't talked about yet, but we will look at a little bit later, is that these were also very color-coded societies. White suburbs were lily white, and there were significant barriers to prevent ethnic minorities from moving there. Many of these communities were very rapidly constructed. You would move to a potato field, your neighbor would move there, you didn't have any connection to them. You were German, they were Jewish, you'd gone to different schools, you'd never seen them before. So you were neighbors, and maybe you'd share tools, but it wasn't like the old ethnic neighborhoods. We were all Dutch, and you'd all go to church together, and you shared the same restaurant and bakeries. The community was a lot more superficial than they had been before. So when we look back at the American dream and post-war society from 1950 to 1970 from a 21st century, say Canadian perspective, it seems to us, that's kind of a superficial, consumeristic, materialistic society. From our perspective, it's very gendered, just repressive. It's not a very healthy society. We might imagine that our society is more well adjusted, more liberal ideas about what is a family, enabling women to escape unhappy marriages and having a career and survive on their own. We might, in all these ways, believe that our society is better, but history is ultimately not about judging which society is better. It's trying to understand that society from the perspective of its own authors and creators. And from that perspective, the automobile suburb was in many ways the dream of the greatest generation. So many GIs came back from the war, and what they wanted were these suburbs. And the evidence we have for that is, they appeared all across the country. 40 million homes were created in the suburb over a 20-year period, and people moved there. So this is a very strong testament that this was their dream. This is what they wanted after the Great Depression and suffering through the war. This was their idea of the good life, the simple life.